The final citation for Leonard Bernstein will be read by Dr. Orrin L. Grossman, Professor of Fine Arts.
A musician of bewildering creativity, Leonard Bernstein has composed music by which we define ourselves as Americans. For 45 years, he has been a leading force in American music as composer, conductor, pianist, and teacher. He has harnessed his extraordinary talents and energies to the task of breaking down artificial barriers between serious and popular culture, European and American music, highbrow and lowbrow taste. As a composer, Leonard Bernstein has given us On the Town, Candide, and West Side Story, works which are among our finest theater pieces. His Mass and his operas Trouble in Tahiti and A Quiet Place have quickly become permanent contributions to the orchestral and operatic repertoire, as have numerous symphonies and ballets. As a conductor, Leonard Bernstein has shattered the myth that only European conductors could lead a major orchestra. His many Grammy Awards with numerous symphony orchestras are testimony to the eloquence and power of his artistic vision. Leonard Bernstein's zeal to communicate the wonder and excitement of the musical experience includes a fierce passion to teach, as well as perform and conduct. For many lucky Americans, his Young People's Concerts with the New York Philharmonic, extending over 14 seasons, provided an exciting introduction to the world of music. The author of 4 books ranging from popular introductions for the layman to complex essays on aesthetics, Leonard Bernstein is indeed a musical polymath. In recognition of his awesome gifts and his warm generosity in sharing them with millions of grateful music lovers, and in recognition of his breadth of vision to see all music as an expression of the human experience, the President and Trustees of Fairfield University proclaim Leonard Bernstein Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa.
You've already been introduced to today's honored speaker. He has just received the honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, and with good reason. Few Americans in our lifetime have made such profound and significant contributions to our culture. The citation we heard just a few minutes ago barely touches on his accomplishments, any one of which would have been sufficient to place him among the most distinguished and talented people in this country. His fame as the conductor for many years of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra precedes him. He has also written some of the finest religious music of the century, including his Mass and his Symphony No. 3, Kaddish, and has been a powerful force in music education through his books and acclaimed television series. Leonard Bernstein has achieved greatness in all of these endeavors, and our world is far better for his accomplishments. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker for Fairfield University's 1989 commencement ceremonies, Mr. Leonard Bernstein.
Golly, 2 introductions. My dear young friends, I feel certain that Father President, Mother Hale, worthy deans, the distinguished learned masters, scholars, and educators on this platform will forgive me if I address myself directly to you, the graduating seniors. Of course, I thank them all most warmly for the fine honor bestowed upon me, but it is not to the matter of honors that I wish to speak today, but straight to you, my young brothers and sisters of our all too small world of higher education. There's a particularly intimate connection I feel with you today, and it is not just the geographical connection, the geographical accident that I am your neighbor a few minutes away in Greenfield Hill. No, it's rather an accident of timing rather than space. Namely, that in the next days I shall be traveling up to my old hometown of Boston, Cambridge, Mass. to be exact, to celebrate my 50th, repeat, 50th class reunion at my beloved old Harvard. Class of 1939. Now, what can that prehistoric date possibly mean to you, except that it was a pretty big year for old movies you may catch on TV now and then. But 50 years, half a century, there's a numerical nugget that hits us all between the eyes. I've always been a sucker for round numbers, to say nothing of round number coincidences like this one, which I take to be divinely planned. There are no accidents, is my theory. But the plain non-mystical fact is that exactly 1/2 century ago, I was sitting precisely where you are now sitting, not so precisely, but so to speak, where you are now sitting on the other side of this platform, and undergoing the same mixed blessings as you are at this moment. I too was glorying in having made it through to diploma land, and I too was tearing at the tassels of my mortarboard as I waited for those august words of wisdom to be uttered from the lofty heights in Harvard Yard, safe and certain that they would send me on my way, that rocky road of transition from the ivy-clad nest of school life into the big rough world of real life, send me on my way with inspiration and lordly guidance. Actually, what I remember hearing was a long and rather pompous valedictory in Latin, and equally, nothing like Kathy's, I tell you, which was beautiful. Followed by an equally lengthy ode to the alma mater in Greek. And then a lot of speeches I've totally forgotten, though they were delivered, I suppose, in English. The worst of it is, and this is a confession that must not leave these hallowed grounds, this booth, so to speak, that I don't even remember who the principal speaker was, to say nothing of his keenly antiquated message. Of course, I've had 50 years to forget it all. Now, that's some kind of generation gap between you and me. A cool 100 years, and it would seem on the face of it to create a distance between us that would all but slaughter any possibility of intimate discourse. And yet, my young siblings, it is quite the contrary, because what I've not forgotten, nor ever will, is the uncertainty, the insecurity of that summer immediately following my graduation. And that I can share directly with you, because I'm sure many of you, if not all, are feeling some of that same insecurity and questioning. Like, am I really going to make it in my chosen field? Have I even really chosen my field? Am I really qualified to succeed as a writer, a banker, a priest, a doctor? Do I really belong in a three-piece suit? Do I really want this summer job coming up? Do I really want any job that's just a job? Or do I want to do something that's of value to the world I inhabit? Or would I just rather play tennis forever? And in the end, will anyone care how I answer any and all of these questions? Well, I care. Because I sense you all very keenly as I relive today in your presence and through you, so to speak, my own post-graduation summer of 1939. That summer was, in a word, wretched. You see, I had chosen my field with a vengeance. It had never occurred to me since I was a little boy that I would ever be anything other than a musician. But my good and loving father disagreed. What kind of dependable livelihood could be expected in the world of music, a world that was utterly foreign to him? He himself had built from scratch a small but sturdy enterprise called the Samuel J. Bernstein Hair Company, whose slogan was Boston's best in the beauty business. And now, his firstborn wants to be a musician. A what? A musician? What kind of profession is that for a nice Jewish boy? How will you support a family? Etc. And so, having given me a fine and fairly expensive Harvard education, he said, in effect, that's it. Now you can come and work in the beauty parlor supplies business. Of course, I rebelled, turned, and fled to the big city of New York to find a job, any job, but preferably a job in music, a job that could enable me to go on being a musician. I didn't even know what that meant at the time. I didn't know what I meant by musician. I composed music, I played the piano, and that's about all. The idea of conducting it never occurred to me. Far too glamorous. After all, I was only a provincial Boston boy job hunting in the big city. And oh, how I hunted. Well, not to keep you in suspense, I never did land a job that summer. The end. Does all this smell a little of self-pity? Yes, perhaps. But let me indulge myself a bit. After all, it is Sunday. As I re-explore that summer, that summer, what was the word I used? Wretched? Too mild a word. I was sharing a sublet way downtown in New York with two friends in an apartment notable for its roaches and absence of air conditioning. And it was hot. One long, continuous, record-breaking heat wave. Some nights I slept on park benches. You could still do that in those days. And other nights I hung out with friends who were performing in a Greenwich Village nightclub. And it stayed hot as July oozed into August, and my meager savings dwindled even as the thermometer rose. At some point in through there, I passed my 21st birthday in despair. A week later, tail between my legs, I boarded a train for Boston and returned home a failure. I beg your indulgence in one more sort of self-pitying memory of that miserable homecoming. I see myself walking wearily to Grand Central Station, suitcase in one hand, train ticket in the other, and $4 in my pocket. Somewhere a few blocks from the train station, I passed a pawn shop in the window of which stood a clarinet, bolt upright, with a price ticket on it of exactly, you guessed it, $4. It was one of those moments of being guided by some unseen force. The next thing I knew, I was the owner of a clarinet, an instrument in which I had no particularly special interest, but it went home with me and became a certain strange source of comfort as I taught myself to play it, depending on what little knowledge of its operating mechanism I had gained in my orchestration course at college. I have no idea where it is now. It got kicked around through one closet after another until it got lost. But as I recall it now, it represents to me the best $4 investment I ever made. In fact, can it be a mere coincidence that my first piece of published music a few years later was to be a clarinet sonata? Ponder that. As I said a moment ago, I mean this talk today to be a kind of intimate discourse. That is, a spontaneous ramble of sharing, not a sermon, not a pep talk, and certainly not a morality tale. And yet, there is a moral. Because as I re-explore that well-known terrain of 1939 through your eyes and ears and sensibilities, I have the feeling of exploring the unknown for the first time, just as you are about to do in your coming months and years. And I find myself seeing that long-ago summer in a new perspective. And this, too, I want to share with you. Was it really all so gruesome and hot and frustrating? Or were there redeeming, positive elements? Yes, there were, and constantly. And here comes the dreaded moral. I alert you to the striking truth that it is particularly in those periods of insecurity and apparent hopelessness that we acquire our most valuable strengths and insights. And I am not speaking only of my magical clarinet, because during that summer I had made wonderful new friends, enjoyed a wide new range of experiences, acquired vast new kinds of information, mainly on how to cope with the challenges of living from one day to the next. Of course, I didn't know that then, at summer's end, when I came home with bowed head and wounded pride, almost ready to give in and join the Samuel J. Bernstein Hair Company. I didn't know then how much I had grown during that long, hard summer. Only now, speaking to you, do I fully recognize how that experience had prepared me for the extraordinary blessings that were about to descend upon me. For indeed, shortly after my disgraceful homecoming, there began an amazing string of events, seemingly coincidental, one feeding into the other, each of which demanded of me a major response of which I would have been totally incapable 2 months earlier. I had begun to learn to cope the hard way, and I was ready to embrace each new challenge with joyful surprise and with equally joyful hard work. That is also when I began to develop my conviction that there are no accidents. I don't mean to sound Jesuitical just to be in the swim of things, but the fact is that the Jesuits know better than anyone the deep mystical meanings behind that word accident. End of moral. And the end of my story of struggle with my father is also joyful. I did live to be a musician and to behold a beaming father, reconciled and proud, whom I could embrace and who embraced me back. I even wound up supporting a family, to his surprise. My story, of course, is not quite over, since I am still here, to my own surprise, and with a future of my own, however long it may be. So that too I can share with you at this commencement 50 years after my own. For I too, like you, am entering a new phase of my life, having recently had a biblical round number birthday. I too, therefore, have my uncertainties and doubts. I too know fear as well as blessedness and gratitude. I am also capable of insecurity and, yes, even despair. I too, like you, am still questioning. How can I best serve my community, which by now is for all practical purposes, the whole world. How can I do my job without ever letting it become just a job? How can I, as an artist, continue to be a political citizen of a world that grows increasingly confused and hard to follow? And most crucially, the old nagging question, what am I going to be when I grow up? Well, what are we all going to be when we grow up? The choices are becoming infinitely more numerous. There are so many good people we can be, so many good things to be done, that the mind reels. At least when I was in school, we knew what we had to do. There were around half dozen causes to fight for, or fight against, if so inclined. We had fascism to fight. There was the brutal war in Spain, and we held rallies. There was Hitler's rape of Czechoslovakia, and we marched in the streets. There were miners in West Virginia stricken with silicosis, and we played the piano and sang to raise money for their medical treatment. There was wheat to be sent to people starving in Africa, as well as in our own Southwest. A few things like that. Count them off on the fingers of maybe one hand. But you young adults today are faced with so many more dozens of problems and causes that they all seem to merge together and seem all but impossible to keep track of. Why, this very day, this beautiful sunny May day, we could be out there demonstrating our support for our fellow students in China, hungering for democracy and demanding more freedom. It's thrilling to behold. And this very day, we could be joining in the New York Walkathon against AIDS. Beautiful day for walking. There is Alaska to worry about. We could be boycotting Exxon. And there is the mess in NATO, the curse of apartheid in South Africa, the endless problems of racial and gender discrimination, the horror of cheap available guns, crime in the streets as well as criminality in high places, Nicaragua, homelessness, poverty. Where does one start? I'll tell you. You start by making a commitment. For instance, to do your part in rendering war obsolete, which it obviously already is, but nobody will admit it. To press for gun control, there's a tough one. Or to find out what you do best and do it for all it's worth. Find out who you really are. Come out of your various closets. Be the best oboe player or businessman or priest that you can be, and commit yourself to it. It almost doesn't matter what you pick, as long as you are truly committed. Whatever single drive you nourish, whatever you do out of love for people and right thinking, whatever it is, it will inform everything else you do. It will show an affirming flame, be a point of light to inform others as well. We simply have to raise ourselves in these new generations out of our passivity, our television-watching stupor, our closing of the eye at the overwhelming super industries of our age, lethal weapons and lethal dope. We must be who we are, behave with the conscience that God gave us, or else what are we? Beasts to be fed? Fashion plates? Semi-educated, nervous, self-centered, greedy yuppies? Now that's strong stuff, I know, but before leaving you hung up as you are on those last string, those question marks, or maybe even a bit miffed, let's return the ball to my court. Let me go back briefly, one last time, to the moment of my hangdog homecoming after that first summer in New York. The actual date of my return was September 1st, 1939, that same infamous day when Adolf Hitler marched into Poland and precipitated the Second World War. For me, this was the last straw, the final crushing blow. I took it personally, as only a wounded young ego can. Shortly thereafter, the great Anglo-American poet Wystan Auden wrote a poem bearing the title September 1, 1939, which I find to be one of the greatest utterances in verse of our time. I would like, as a sort of coda, to read you the beginning and the end of it, not to change the intimate nature of our discourse, but actually to intensify it. Here goes, stanza 1. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. That's stanza 1, a short, shocking history lesson. It needs no explanation. Now I shall skip 6 stanzas, arriving at the next to last one, in which history has now become personal moral philosophy. It goes like this. All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. That is the artist talking, the prophet, the oracle. No one exists alone. Remember that. We must love one another or die. Remember that. But it is the final stanza which I most commend to your hearts and minds. In it, the poet takes an oath, which I fervently take with him, and so I pray will you. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yet, dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Amen.